Well, welcome to Hyper Live, and special guest today, Ben Lamorte in the US, and we're joined by Martin Kearns, co-host Daniel as always, and today's topic is OKR Mythbusters. So debunking the most common misconceptions about OKRs. And so I'll pass over to you, Ben, as our expert today, and maybe just give us a bit of background, and then we'll start digging into the topic.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to do the old decade by decade thing. So, and by the way, I'm in my 50s, so I'm not going to tell you the zeros and the tens. Let's just say I was a kid. Then in my 20s, I went off and did graduate school at Stanford in management science because I had done mechanical engineering and I wanted to do something that was more with people. So I somehow thought that if it had management or economics in there, that would work. Ended up doing management consulting. But the thing is, I was a mechanical engineering background. And the management consulting guys looked at me and said, hey, wait a minute, you're an engineering guy. Hey, here's a computer, go do access databases and spreadsheets. So I did that for 3 or 4 years. I actually became really good at building spreadsheets, VLOOKUPs and all that good stuff. And I did that for a while and became kind of known as the database spreadsheet guy, and then got into business intelligence. This was not what I wanted to do. So I stop here for a minute and just say, if you're in your 20s, be careful that they don't just say, oh, you're this, and they put you behind the computer. If you don't want to be behind the computer, get out of there. That's my first big tip from today. Anyway, spent my 20s doing that. And then in my early 30s, I kind of got more into management. I was starting to work a little bit more with people at a .com startup. It was planetrx.com. We were going to sell drugs online. That's a whole nother podcast because it was it failed. But we raised like 300 or 400 million. Actually, it was probably $500 million. We went through it in 4 years, and we sort of set the path for the big companies to come in and figure out how to do it after we screwed up. So another lesson learned. Then what happened was I started getting into sort of startups and becoming everything. If you're in a startup, I was marketing, I was sales. This was like therapy for me. I spent all that time in front of a computer. Now I was getting out, doing marketing, doing business development, meeting with people. Had a great time, but it was startups that sort of never really took off, and I never really made any money from that, even though I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, right? So a lot of my friends are doing great. And then luckily, this is sort of that was maybe the low point of my story, okay? It's going to get better. So then I ended up at this one startup where it was 300,000, 600,000, a million. And it was kind of we're going to strike out. This was around 2008. I sort of thought, well, we're lucky that we're even at 1 million because we could just be shut down. Well, basically, if you're a startup and you have investors and you're going 1 million, you're basically going to be out of business. So I pulled in this guy, Jeff Walker. Now, Jeff Walker I happened to know him through sort of a friend type of a thing. And he was the founder of Oracle Applications. So you've probably heard of Oracle and you've heard of Larry Ellison. Well, it turns out back in the 80s, Oracle was just a hardware company, maybe 20 to 40 million in revenue. Jeff Walker comes in and builds Oracle Applications. And 5 years later, there's $1 billion company. The rest is history. So even if you ask Larry Ellison, he'll say, yeah, well, Jeff Walker really was the founder of Oracle. Let's be clear. I mean, we started it and all that, but Jeff came in and did Oracle Applications. And from there on, I made a connection with Jeff and I said, Jeff, will you come in and be my advisor for my company? Because he had also started a company that was called Pillar. My CEO of my startup was the guy that started Pillar, which was really the top budgeting and planning software back in the day. So I had this guy that was a guru, but he was in his 60s or early 70s by the time we were at this point. And Jeff Walker came in. He was, pretty old himself, but not quite that old. Let's just say he was very young. I'm not going to say anything bad about Jeff. He was a very young middle-aged guy. But he shows up and I have lunch with him. And it was a pivotal moment because those two guys connected. And Jeff started coaching me because I was all over the place. Even now, I do an introduction. Let me just tell you my whole life story, right? So it ended up that Jeff and my CEO became buddies, and Jeff became my mentor. So he would be the advisor who would sit in on board meetings and all that. And he would take me aside after the board meeting, and he would sometimes say things like, this was the first example, actually. He said, Ben, great job, except, you seem to be all over the place. Let me ask you a question. When you go on a hike, do you have a destination? And I started talking about my family and my daughter at the time, who was 4, and we kind of go to a park. We sort of have a destination, but we might see a waterfall. We sort of go where we go. And he said, Ben, when I ask you about your family, I'm happy to hear about your daughter and the waterfall and your hiking. But when we're at work, do you realize that if you don't have a clear destination, you're wasting my time, you're wasting your time, and you're wasting everybody else's time who reports to you, which is a third of the company? And then he went Oracle on me, so I won't repeat that here. But Jeff was a good advisor. And he said, Ben, let me tell you what you could have said. You could have said, here's where we want to get. This is the objective. Here's why we want to get there. Pause. Make sure I understand what you're talking about. Give me here's how we will know we get there. Turns out these were going to be the key results. And then what are we doing to achieve those key results? And then if you're really smart, you'll ask me what you should be doing to achieve those key results. And I ultimately realized that what he was saying was so spot on that I actually got, coached in this OKR methodology before I really even knew what OKRs were. He called it MOKRs, mission, objective, key results. And he had used that at Oracle. And he actually considers that a superpower for one of the reasons that Oracle was able to scale. So then I started doing this OKR coaching, kind of channeling Jeff Walker with other people, even though it wasn't my job. And actually, this was really the first time where I was delivering value to people. Like I'm not going to say that the other stuff I did in Access and Excel was useless, but people were like, whoa, this is really helpful. Like, I want to talk to you for more. Like, I'd have a meeting for an hour and they would, we'd be 2 hours in. They said, no, don't go. Like, this is really helpful. So that's when I became an OKR coach. And this is the closing statement. This is the key point. Okay. Because I had this job where that really wasn't my job to do OKRs coaching. And Jeff said, well, what's the one thing that you do really well, that you love to do, and that really adds value? And I said, OKRs coaching. And he said, how many hours a week are you doing? I'm like, 2 or 3. And he said, you need to make that 30 to 40. And I said, but Jeff, that's not even part of my job description. And he said, well, then quit your job. Just start going and doing this and you'll find out how big the market is. And so I did that in about 2000, I guess I want to say 2010, 2011, 2012, in that range. And by 2013, I started OKRs.com, and we took off kind of slowly because OKRs was not a main thing. I was just, door to door. Hey, want to do OKRs? It's amazing. Close the door. But eventually I would get in with somebody and then they would say, wow, this is amazing. Because sure enough, it really was a value add. So really for the first time in my life, I was doing something that I was like, okay, this moves the needle. Okay. And by the way, OKRs are all about moving the needle. So I was like, oh, this is great. And so pretty much the last 12 years, that's what I've been doing. OKRs coaching, really all around the world, big companies, small companies, you name it.
Fantastic. I really want to hear more in terms of what you've seen and some of the myths as well. But first of all, maybe Martin, do you want to just introduce yourself? I know you're also an OKR expert, as is Daniel. So I feel like I'm the only person who's not an OKR expert on the call. But Kenzie, over to you.
Yeah. So my name is Martin. I don't have the same breadth of story to give you today. I started off as a programmer. I kind of learned there's a different way of working from a dynamic perspective when I joined the mobile phone industry in 2002. I remember resigning from insurance to move into what was a future that had yet no one really know what was happening. Like, not everybody had a phone at the time when I started, and I just really loved the fast pace and the evolution inside of that. Met a girl in Scotland. 2 kids later, thought we need to go to Australia for a couple of years. That was 20 years ago. I'm still here. And in that time, I kind of went into consulting, and I originally didn't want to do OKRs or like OKRs. I had an agile practice, and I kind of delegated it to another person. And it was only when I read Ben's book did I kind of join the dots on quite a lot of things. So from then, I really dived right into it. And it's kind of been so when I went out on my own 4 years ago, it was something that is a key pillar to the offerings, and mainly because it's one of the best ways to try and form strategic advice is to think about an OKR and just even the conversations that you have to kind of get there. So I started talking to Ben and became a global lead of OKRs.com. It's it's a conglomerate of thinking, and yeah, I've always wanted to kind of do this podcast with you guys with Ben, because I think the synergies that we have are unique, and he's it's a really fresh way of looking at things. It goes beyond the starting book, and yeah, I think it's quite pragmatic, and it's real. It's happened. It's not a theory.
I'll be really interested to hear from you guys about how it's evolved over the last sort of 10 plus years. So, because I think it probably went from, introducing OKRs as sort of a 101 topic, and now there's familiarity and that there's been some popularity there. And so what do you need to help people with now in terms of OKRs?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. Look, going to the beginning, like I mentioned, Jeff Walker at Oracle in the 80s using OKRs. So it really starts with, a small group of tech companies in the Silicon Valley. Really, this kind of goes viral, this OKR methodology. Comes out of Intel. And then fast forward into the 90s, still, it's basically tech companies using OKRs, in the Silicon Valley. So it hasn't taken off more globally or anything like that. And then in the 2000s, I want to say it was about 2000, let's see, what was it? 2014. I think it was 2014. That's not much going on with OKRs until then. And then it's almost like the bell rings. And the bell is this Google Ventures video put out by this guy, Rick Clow. And, he's doing it. He's actually filling in for somebody. He doesn't even want to do it. Apparently, this video was just sort of like an internal workshop thing, and they put it online somehow. And everybody sort of found out that, oh my gosh, Google's doing OKRs. And back then in 2014, it's hard to believe this. Well, maybe not. But at the time, Google was really the thought leader. I mean, it was no longer Harvard Business Review. Nobody cared about magazines. If Google sneezed, everybody turns their car and says, what did they do? What kind of sneeze? Was it loud? So it's like Google's doing OKRs. Everybody has to jump on the bandwagon. No, not everybody. But you'll see, for example, other companies, other industries, it's kind of becoming, maybe I would say OKRs is becoming more of a cult movement among CEOs who watch this video. And you have companies like Sears, other companies, that are not, like at the time, Sears was basically a retailer, not a tech company at all. And so you can imagine that OKR starts to take off right around 2014, 2015 is really when I see it expanding. And now, if you look today, you're seeing OKRs in everywhere. I mean, I have clients in government, I have, nonprofits, and it's not just in the Silicon Valley, it's not just in the US, it's all over the world. And what ended up happening, and I like your point, Daniel, about like, well, how do, what are the services that we have to offer? How does that happen? Because what happens is there's one bell, which was the Google Ventures video that promoted OKRs and it got it going. But then in 2018, the book Measure What Matters comes out. And this is a game changer because now it's got stories about Bill Gates and Bono. And it's, it's in the airports, you're seeing, Measure What Matters. Now it's becoming more of once you read that book, which is basically a sales book for OKRs. If you're a CEO and you read that book, I don't care what company you're at, you're like, I got to do OKRs. Basically, it's a good sales book for OKRs or something similar, some kind of a goal-setting methodology that aligns the company where we can all talk this way and align and move the needle in the direction we want to go. So then a bunch of people, look at, who you are, lazy CEOs. They read the book, they get excited and say, guys, go do this. I want it everywhere. Let's get this thing going. We should have been doing this a long time ago. And this, by the way, is a fail. So you have more and more organizations just sort of quickly adopt OKRs. Let's go. It's going to be amazing. And I would say most of those companies failed because they went too fast. They started doing all these, I would say sort of classic errors of OKRs. And so that's when my business picked up. Thank you, John Doerr, for writing Measure What Matters, because you created this massive demand for OKRs coaching because so many people who read the book went on and implemented OKRs. They know down deep that this can be good, but then they failed. So they would call me up and I got to go. So that's what's going on. And I mean, I'll leave it at that. I'd say now OKRs is almost a household term. I mean, I talk to people and they're like, yeah, OKRs. And some people love it and some people hate it. I found that to be the case. And it's, of course, some people hate it, right? Because they probably fell victim to the system of my CEO read this book, go implement it. And they have no idea what they're doing. I guess I'll give you the fine print. This is me venting a little bit. There's now a Coursera class, $40 or some LinkedIn class or something. You pay $40 and you can be certified in OKRs because you watch these videos. It's like 8 hours of training. So it turns out that's not quite enough to just say, well, I did the videos. So now we can implement OKRs in a Fortune 500 company. I'm certified on the video. So you're still seeing this trend of organizations, rolling out OKRs and failing. Now, a lot of them are succeeding too. But I'm just pointing out that I think in the early days of the Silicon Valley, 80s, 90s, maybe 2000s, 90% of companies that used OKRs were wildly successful with the methodology. And now it's maybe more like 50-50, right? You have a lot of people out there that are doing it and they're just not making it work.
Yeah, that sounds like you just had our first myth there, Ben. So the idea that you can have 8 hours of training and be an OKRs expert.
Yeah. There's there's two other elements I'd add to this. When OKRs start to get popular, is with startups kind of and orientating the whole company around an objective. One of the evolutions, and one that I play in mainly, is the way in which OKRs then were framed to focus on strategic investment, your strategic growth. So, one of the things that when I learned about Ben, he's the first person to realize that OKRs and KPIs coexist. It's not a battle. Not one has to win over the other. And if you are, for the larger organization, how you're using an OKR to really assess your strategic ambition and delivery versus where everyone has an OKR, even everyone has an individual OKR, and it's let's just replace it and it'll look like a KPI and it'll act like a KPI and we won't learn anything. So I find that ADHD kind of, let's use OKRs to set an annual objective. Let's have a workshop and we're done. They've lost half the value, because it's about having an ongoing conversation. It's not a goal setting framework, right? It's a framework to support ongoing assessment on an ambition that you have aimed for at the quarter, at the annual, at the key results, at the monthly check-in. There's these aspects so that it's always front of mind. And there's a lot of organizations that say they're doing OKRs, and that means they think about it in January and they'll kind of rush it again in December when bonuses are needing to be considered. So I think there's still a long way to go for it to become, ever present in the monthly narrative of business.
That's great. It sounds like our second myth there, that OKRs are just an annual event as opposed to, continually refined throughout the year. What else are you seeing, Ben, in terms of what are the main or the kind of key myths or the things that people really struggle with?
Well, I do think that one of the myths with OKRs is that, you put in OKRs and we should get it at all levels of the organization. And maybe this builds off what you were saying too, Martin, which is to say, even big companies, by the way, big companies didn't really used to use OKRs. It was mostly like, I think you were saying this, right, Martin? It was like more of a startup thing, tech companies, relatively small.
Yeah.
Intel was a relatively large company when it was using OKRs. So it's not to say it was only small companies, but it was becoming very popular for startups to use OKRs.
Exactly, yeah.
Even today, I think most startups find that OKRs is an incredibly valuable system for communicating. And if you use it early, it can be a big win. But now with the big companies, the issues became quite different. I was just on with the largest, beer company of Malaysia. They've been using OKRs now for 4 years. And I was really kind of in a way surprised, but also pleased to hear that the COO said the biggest win of OKRs is that we now have critical thinkers. So we have, like, of the 30 managers, he's like, these 30 managers have transformed, all but one. I mean, we won't name names, but he just gave me that whole speech. There was just one guy, So, out of the 29 managers, actually, he was like, there was this one guy that just didn't get it. But basically, they were, when I mean critical thinkers, there's two components of this, right? One is that they know how to ask questions. That's what that means. They know how to say, like, wait, what is our objective here? Why is that important? So they would challenge things rather than just doing tasks. And so, especially at a manager level, that's important, because otherwise you're just, you really better, as the leader of the company, you better tell them to do the right thing, because they're going to go down this path and they're just going to blindly do this work. In fact, that's what he said. People are no longer blind. It's as if they can see, and they're really what he would call more outcomes oriented. So there were two things. One, they were critical thinkers, and two, they were outcomes oriented. And what this translated into was empowerment, right? I don't have to have as many one-on-ones every week. Like, these people, they know what they need to do. They have more autonomy. And so we're able to execute, and it's freeing up our time from all these lengthy meetings of making sure everybody's on track and trying to, like, make sure this initiative is complete by this percentage, by this date or whatever. They're just like, go for it. You know the outcome we need, go make it happen. And I don't hear that all the time, by the way. This is not like to say this is what happens with OKRs every time. But I found it really refreshing to hear that this was their experience. And the CEO also validated, had the same experience. I will say the one thing that they argued about was how to use OKRs as a performance management tool. Because in the Asian cultures in general, I don't want to stereotype all Asian cultures, but I'll make sort of an in general, this tends to be true. There's more of a hierarchical system of management, and especially true in India. I mean, this is just the way it is. Like, you can't mess with this. And then at the same time, there's also this thought of, okay, well, if this is the important goal, if we achieve it, then that's how I should get paid. But, which is actually a pretty logical argument. I don't want to totally debate that. But those two, the CEO and the COO, had to debate that. And it turns out they came out on the side of not using OKRs as part of the formal performance management and bonus calculations, which is good, because if you start conflating your OKRs with your performance management and stuff, you sort of lose the value of the critical thinking and the free-flowing ideas and the stretch thinking that happens with OKRs. So that's just an interesting case study of how OKRs can add value and how it's sort of, it's not like OKRs was responsible for 20% of our revenue. Like, you can never do that. Don't even ask that question. That's a silly thing to say. But it can, and I've seen this happen not just with this one beer company, but I've seen it happen where managers are actually better managers because they're using this OKRs framework.
So it sounds like that is our third myth, maybe, in terms of how OKRs are linked to performance and whether they should be linked directly. It's pretty cool to hear that that's been adopted in Malaysia. So I spent 10 years there and was a very big advocate of outcomes thinking, and we'd used OKRs there. So might be some of the people I've worked with spreading out to other companies.
Yeah, I think, on the outcomes thinking, this is a critical point. Like, there is this movement toward outcomes thinking. And, we want to focus on results, not just, what work I've done or what percentage effort or whatever. And it turns out OKRs is basically a way of moving toward that outcome mindset, that outcomes thinking. So I've actually worked with some organizations which said, we don't want to do OKRs, but we want to hire you because we want to do outcomes thinking. And I'm like, okay, I'll do that. I'm basically going to do OKRs, but we're just not going to call it OKRs. And that seems to work. And I'll give you one other story. I'm a little bit biased because I found that OKRs just really works. I'm maybe not quite as religiously into OKRs as I used to be, because I've been doing this for 15 years. There was a period where I was just wild for OKRs, but I'm still very optimistic, because I did a goal setting workshop with a big Fortune 500 company where I had been using OKRs in a pocket of the organization. And so I was in the vendor list, and they said, oh, this guy's really good with OKRs. He probably could do a goal setting workshop. So this one group brought me in to do a goal setting workshop, but they said, but it's not going to be OKRs. Well, we want to hire you. And I said, well, okay, what do you want to do? Just annual goals, kind of resetting our thoughts, getting our goals out, figuring out how to align. I'm like, okay, they're going to pay me a lot of money, right? So I'm like, sounds good. But I was driving down there with kind of a scratching my head. I'm like, wait, what are we doing here? It turns out it was a complete disaster, because when you say goal setting, that can mean literally the brainstorming was we want to be better at customer service. We want to have more employee recognition. We want to be a safer space. We want to have, I'm like, okay, what? And some of these goals are be the leader in our field. I mean, what does that even mean? Or, some of it's 10-year time frame, some of it's this year. We just have no idea what we're talking about. So it was more New Year's resolutions with your family, where you get a big poster and you put all these ideas down. And like you said, it wasn't a process. So it was I did this one workshop, we wrote down these things. Wow, okay. And then we just go back to work. So there was no actual plan on how any of this stuff's going to get done. It was just, like I said, it was kind of a disaster. They still paid me, but I did not feel good about that. And I remember saying to myself, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm not going to just do goal setting workshops, whatever that means. Because when you're taking OKRs, you're embracing sort of a disciplined approach. I will now read the definition of OKRs. I think it's useful to hear this. OKRs is a critical thinking framework. First of all, it's a verb, not a noun. So it's not like we said, it's not like, here are my OKRs, I'm done. There they are. It's not a noun. It's not a thing. OKRs is a critical thinking framework, meaning a set of questions you ask. It's an ongoing discipline, meaning we ask these questions all the time. We don't just ask them once a quarter or once a year or whatever. We're bringing them in all the time. It's trying to get employees to work together, which I'll pause there to say, that means you might not want to have OKRs for every individual employee. Because once you do that, you're pitting employees against each other. I'm going to focus on mine, you focus on yours. Similarly, if you look at an org chart, you might not have an OKR for every department, because then they're just going to work in more silos, right? So you might want to bring two teams together, or you might want to have an OKR that's cross-functional, right? And we want them to focus effort to make measurable contributions so that we achieve our most important goals. And at the end of the day, it's about focusing effort to make measurable contributions, right? But it doesn't mean we should measure everything. I also come back to that measure what matters thing, right? So it's OKRs is not supposed to be all of our work. I guess maybe that's another myth, is I should be spending 100% of my time on my OKRs. My OKRs are my most important thing, therefore that's what we should do. Everything else, forget it. But that's a huge problem for anyone trying to adopt OKRs, because OKRs are the area of focus where we want to move the needle, right? Unlike all the KPIs, which are metrics that might be in a healthy range that we want to continue to track, but we're not trying to move every needle in the right direction all the time. We've got to focus in the near term on something. And by the way, this is also the elephant in the room. Some leadership teams, I think you said it, Martin, like the conversations that you have, wow, I can assess this leadership team if they're going to be successful or not within about 30 minutes. Because you start asking them about the OKRs, and if they're just saying, well, we need profit, we need revenue, we need to reduce costs, like all these financial things, I'm like, okay, that's not leadership. Anybody that works in a company knows we need to make more money and we need to have profit. Like, if you're telling me that at your annual leadership meeting, I mean, I'm just like checking my phone. You know,
those are just the outputs, right?
You got to give me a focused area. This is what we're going to focus on: customer retention. Here's why. Okay. And then now I'm okay, wait, we got a customer retention. Okay, wait, why do we need to do that? Okay, we need to do it now. Here's how we'll know that we've achieved it. These are the key results. This is the current level. We need to move it from X to Y. This is what the competition is doing. If we don't do this, we're out of business. If we do this, we can make money. This is the driver to our financial success. Sure, ultimately, I want to have financial success, but the OKR and the leadership, those come together when there's something that I can relate to that feels more actionable, right?
That's fantastic. I think there's a couple of myths we could call out there as well, like, you know, the idea of the systems thinking. So, you know, OKRs aren't departmental, because otherwise you're going to get, you know, conflict in terms of the overall goals of the organization. And the other myth I heard in there, I think there were a few, but the other one I picked up in there was the don't measure everything. So, you know, measure some of the things that are going to move the needle.
So I think for me, when we talk about the word outcome, we just have to be really careful, right? Because the idea of what we're talking about is sometimes these are outcomes which we're entering into new territory. So we don't even know how to measure it yet, because we've never done it before. Because if it was already something that was in our health metrics, we wouldn't probably need to give it this level of focus, or it's just not working, we need to revisit it. So there's a sense of, when you start looking at the outcome, there's those parts to it which the key results help us with, which is, okay, well, can we get an agreement on the outcome? So there's these kind of milestones which are decisions that are, you know, they don't add value, but they're, you know, they're very important to get there. By doing that, we probably start realizing the baselines that we're trying to get settled on, so that we actually have something to aim for. And now that we've got a baseline and we know what we're measuring for that, you know, on we go to let's create a, you know, a tangible metric that we can work towards, and then ask ourselves, how are we going to do that? Like, that doesn't happen in a meeting. It happens over time, and
it iterates.
You know,
exactly. You have it 2 weeks later, you're like, okay, that's not working. We got to try something else.
Yeah, and you know, when you think about it, when you're starting to create a strategic ambition, on something that you know is new to you, you're at your least level of competency, because you've no tacit experience in it. So surely you're going to say, yeah, let's hedge your bet, let's give this a shot, and at some point in time, let's see if we've learned if it's working. Have we moved the needle in any shape or form? And if so, let's double down on it and let's try and get those baselines. So there's these natural progressions that you need to have in order to achieve, you know, a result. And it you know, I find sometimes we just think that our original thinking is the right one, and let's keep it that way. Whereas with an OKR, if you're not adjusting it over time, it was probably a crappy one in the first place, because you were only prescripted to what you know, and you really didn't embrace any form of learning and adaptiveness. And I think you adapt to your strategy, you don't just deliver it.
Along this line of thinking, I'm interested in both your opinions about how strict an objective should represent an outcome versus, say, an activity or something else.
Well, let me just say that an objective itself should be pretty broad, and it should be a verb, and it shouldn't necessarily reflect an outcome. Like, I'll give you an example. This is better to tell you a case study. So I'm working with this company. They're like a high-level spa, a super cool spa, but they know that they have a problem, and it's easy for them to list problems, you know. And those problems tend to be customer experience early in the process. Like once they get in and they're doing this, it's like amazing, right? But like the getting the appointment, the waiting in line, all this stuff, they're like, no, that's just like, we're like an airport or something. It's like once you're on the plane and if you're in first class, everything's great. But it's the darn, how do I get through security? I just want to get on the damn plane. So they were having that experience. So their objective was to improve the early customer experience. And they could tell you why, and they could tell you why now. And they really had a great objective. It wasn't really an outcome, right? The objective is more of a flavor of what area of our business needs attention. And so usually objectives are pretty easy to come up with, and they're validated by the why and why now. And when a leadership team really says, yeah, okay, we all know we need to do that. The thing is, and this is the outcome problem, instead of thinking like, well, what are the outcomes? How will we know we've improved that early customer experience? They're going to start saying things like, we need to update the website. We need to, put cameras in the line so we can start tracking, how long it's taking people to get in. We need to like have a VIP thing. We need to put in, a code where people can get in, like it's like they can just show their phone. It'll be a QR code. And so all these people are coming up with all these ideas, things we should do, right? And this is where it's like, sometimes I'm glad I'm not a CEO, because I would feel a little bit like a teacher, like, hey, kids, everybody shut up. It's like all these ideas of things we should do are not really helping us, because all of those things are going to cost money. They're not really vetted. We have to sort of pause. And so that's where the outcomes come into play. And after about an hour of dealing with this group, we ultimately kept asking these questions, right? What is the intended outcome of this? What is the intended outcome of that? And ultimately, there was a nice key result metric that showed up. And one of them was increase the percentage of spa reservations that are made on the website from like 20% to 40%. And the reason was the people that made the reservation on the website, everything worked. Those people knew how to do it, and they were able to get their treatment, and they would go in and they would have the thing and it was in the system and they would just go. But people were showing up like without an appointment, or they were calling in and then now they're talking and it's like, okay, I have to call this person and put it in the system on the back end. And there were all these inefficiencies that were overwhelming. So when they came up with that outcome, now it's like, okay, we all agree that's what we want to see. Now we can talk about what are the things that are going to help us get to that outcome. And by the way, this is the classic begin with the end in mind from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People speech, right? It goes back to when my advisor, Jeff Walker, said, start with the destination, right? Tell me where we want to get. Make it a measurable statement. We all understand what that is. And now we can talk about what we're going to do. The problem is people come up with the objective. They're all excited. And then they start saying, here's all the things we're going to do. And they're missing that step. And this is really the magic of the outcome mindset. The outcome mindset has to start with the objective and like, oh yeah, we all agree that's why but it's not itself an outcome. But that's that context that creates the universe. Now let's agree on what those outcomes look like. That will tell us, yes, we're moving us toward that objective. That's the next step. And then we talk about what we're going to do. The problem is our brains just start going into what we're going to do. I want to fix it. I got to do this. I got to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I've learned that there's nothing wrong with the way that we think. But we have to stop, pause, and this is what good leaders need to do, and say, what does the outcome look like? How will we measure our success? And that's like, I would say, the hard part of OKRs is actually figuring out what those outcomes are. Of course, the hard part is always the next step, right? So once we know the outcomes, the question is, the hard part is to execute and achieve those outcomes. But it's exciting because when you do achieve those outcomes, you'll be surprised, right? You're like, okay, wait, that was the outcome we focused on. We achieved it. We got it from, I think this company I was working with, they went from 20%. They ended up hitting like 45%. This had major impacts on their customer experience. Now they're not where they want to be. There's still a lot of other work that needs to get done. But it's like, oh, we had a win, right? As opposed to we did a bunch of stuff. We put our codes up. We made a lot of progress. We got everybody can have iPads now. You can log in from iPad. Woohoo! But is that good? I don't know. It's like we can log in from iPads now. I don't even know if that's good. We spend a lot of money doing it, and people are doing it. But what if those customers are having a bad experience now? I mean, I don't know. So
it's interesting. You described it as almost like a chain of cause and effect that led up to the objective, like in your description of how. And I often see this pattern of companies start with a focus just on the activities. Then they introduce the concept of outcome thinking, and then they're at the end, but maybe not thinking about the steps. And what you're describing is the combination of the two, of like almost we know this objective, but what are all the things that might add up to it, and what do we change as we're learning as we go along?
So one way to look at the objective is, I believe that any objective should motivate people. It should motivate people to come together that have never worked together before. It should be a higher level of focus that, isn't something that just, reigns within a department. It gives you this sense of courage, ambition, and desire. So I would never want to kill that by saying, and here's your outcomes. One of the things then is, and what next? So managers have to accept that they're not the smartest people when it comes to execution, because usually execution, they haven't done it for a while, sometimes decades. So there has to be some way that we're allowing the OKR to be inclusive of everyone. And for me, if I'm kind of clear on the why, let some other people into the conversation on how. I might have an idea, but allow that to be critical. And I think that's where the concept in an OKR of cascading comes. Like when you talk about cascading, you don't cascade, okay, when we cascade, what I'm going to cascade to you is your objective, your key results, your metrics, and while I'm at it, these are the key outcomes that you need to deliver in the next 20 months. What part of that is motivational? What part of that is inclusive? So when we think about cascading, we have to leave space for people to join in and to add value and to add thought and add diversity, because that's what will make you smarter. If you have a bunch of gray-haired execs who think they're the smartest in the room because they've been around the longest, well, best of luck with anything digital, because you don't have a digital experience, and you have no chance with AI because you don't have that practical touch point either. So we just have to remember that there is strength to leadership. There's also weakness, and I think OKRs gives us the way to bring everyone on the journey and to get the value from everyone together to really make a difference. And that's kind of the only reason you should use an OKR, because you've got a desire to make a difference in some way.
So given that, Martin and Ben, then who do you feel should be setting OKRs? Is it the leaders? Is it the teams? Is it a combination? Like, how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, I mean, let's say the top level of the organization, like I keep on pointing at the CEO, the leadership team, the office of the CEO, supposedly, right, should have set the objectives. I mean, this is their job, right? As leaders, they need to set the strategic direction of the company. But like Martin said, they can't just say the objective is increase the early customer experience, make it better, make our early customer experience better. That's not good enough. They might be right on that objective, but they have to tell me the story about why is that so important and why now. And that can be quantitative. You can start talking about competition. You can start talking about how we're leaving money on the table. There's all kinds of things. You can give us a story. Anecdotes are great, right? You can say, we had a customer who was, visiting from, Japan. They were like royalty. They showed up and they had to wait, and then they left, and we just lost that. And now this is an influencer in Japan, and it's gonna screw us over internationally or whatever. You can come up with stories like that. So we can't have that happen anymore. So now people have something that's motivational, that's tangible. Now the key results, usually a good leadership team will come up with one or two of the key results for that objective as context, and then invite other people to contribute toward those key results, as far as defining what they look like, proposing what a key result looks like. But what's even more important is, once we have the key result nailed down, going back to Martin's idea of cascading, that leadership team will have a key result. I keep on going to my example of increase the percentage from 20 to 40% of people who sign up on the website for their appointment. That was that tangible key result that was super measurable. It was right on track with their objective. Now, we might ask different department heads or even individuals within the department, what would we need to do? What would be a way of knowing that we could drive that forward? And the telephone people are like, well, why don't we tell them when they call us to go to the website, and we're going to give them a coupon code for 10%, and we're going to tell them that we can see it. Oh, yep, the appointment has been made. So we teach the people the first time that they sign up how to use the website form, because by the way, the context was, the reason why the website wasn't getting so many hits there was that it was a pretty clunky website form. It was, click here, click there, have a drop down, did you install Flash or whatever? It was like people were having a hard time. So the telecom people or whatever, the inbound callers were like, wait a minute, we'll coach them up on how to do it. Then people had a great experience signing up on the website. And then of course their experience was better. And they increased the percentage signing up on the website, et cetera, et cetera. Once you were in on the website, you know how to do it. It was easy to do the next one. So that was a big thing. And then the marketing team said, wait a minute, this form sucks. Let's make our own marketing campaign with a landing page that's super simple, which is all like one sheet, which captures the minimal viable information such that then they can sign up for the appointment. That's like 80% of the time people just want this basic spa service. They get that. They can't have all the other things. Forget that. We're just going to move the needle on that, because most new people that we're going to be marketing to, they just want to experience the spa. They don't need, aromatherapy, private massages or something. So it got everybody thinking about, okay, what can we do to drive that key result? And that was the right conversation for them to have.
Hey, Ben, I never told you this story, but hopefully you'll like it. So to answer your question, Daniel, everything that Ben said is true. But like one of the things that you then don't do is say everybody must do every objective, right? Because how does that work? So what I introduced my meatloaf analogy. So the meatloaf rule is 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So if we had 3 objectives, you cascade down 2 and leave space for the 3rd objective for the department or the team to set. So there's you always have to leave some space for localization, right? So now you mightn't like 3 objectives and 2 out of 3 is bad for you. Well, then come up with a different number. But I just think you have to, if that space isn't there, well, then the idea of self-determination gets lost. The idea of kind of being part of this gets lost. The ability to be informing executives something they don't know about is lost. So for me, when we think about it, if we don't leave that space for some levels of creativity or innovation, whatever word you like, there's a risk that we're back to square one, which is a command top down, and everybody must do what we say. And that's I don't know, but I don't think any of us would be motivated to be in that environment, never mind design it. So maybe Meatloaf had a thing to tell us.
We had a distinction between cascading and aligning, and I think you've described a lot of the reasons why that there was a distinction there in terms of the space for people to influence the goals and things like that. If everything was cascaded, then it takes away a lot of the autonomy, and there is knowledge, at the precipice, at the coal face, in front of the customer. And there you can get as much information coming from there up to leadership as you can from leadership to the teams. And
I'll
so
give you a quick story about that. The direct cascade is the way that John Doerr's football example goes in the book, Measure What Matters. And I talked to John about it. And he said, oh, yeah, that nobody would ever do that. I'm not going to put that in the book. He said, I'm not going to put that in the book because it's really misleading. And then, of course, it's in the book. And not only is it in the book, it's like the most popular thing that's mentioned, because everybody's like, oh, the football team, and you got to win the Super Bowl, and you have your offense and your defense. I mean, it's just like, it's so easy to understand, and it's so programmable in a computer, and it just makes you feel like we're so aligned. It makes you want to win the Super Bowl. But at the end of the day, it's not reflective of any business that I've ever seen. So it's actually kind of a bad example. It's actually one of the worst examples you can put out there, because it assumes everything's a subset of the thing below it. And I'll give you the example that that never happens, by the way, in the real world. I had a data platform team. This was a Fortune 500 company back in the pandemic. And the top level objective was expand into mobile services, get on Uber Eats and all these kind of things like that, right? Because of the pandemic, short-term goals. And a lot of people rallied around it. But the data platform team was sitting here going like, well, that's great. We got some work we can do with that. But we have our own OKR. And what we need to do is migrate all these legacy databases and get them off of these things. We got 1,000 stores on DOS. I don't know if anybody remembers DOS. And they were literally, and I kid you not, it was like they had to call, like there were 3 guys in India that knew how to like go into the back end and do this thing in DOS or something if they ever had an update. I mean, they were like, the CTO was like, no, like we could be screwed if we don't get these things off this thing. So their OKR was to migrate off the legacy platforms. They had key results about moving, these stores or whatever. It sounded like just a bunch of busy work. But because the objective was their objective that they created, and they had a very clear why and why now, that was their focus for that, next 6 months. And when they showed it back up to the CEO said, oh yeah, you better damn well do that. I'm with you. So the alignment happened in a side conversation, but it was not in any kind of OKR map or this fells, directly cascades to this, like a football team, and your offense has to give me 300 yards. And then this, it's not like that. This data platform team was doing something completely unrelated to anything related to the company level OKRs. I mean, you could try to say it was related, but you would, it just really wasn't. I hate to say it. And that's okay. The point is that's okay, because we do want that free thinking from the lower levels in the organization to propose up their OKRs to leadership. And if you use the language of OKRs at a lower level, but if you speak to leadership, and I think our objective should be this for our area, here's why, and here's why now, and these are the key results. What we find is that leadership says, okay, great, let's do that most of the time, because that's the way they want you to talk to them. They don't want you to talk to them with, we have all this work we need to do. There's all this stuff with Oracle databases, and there's this DOS thing. And we have all these problems we're trying to solve. Leadership is like, you guys are no. We want to move the needle. We don't. This just sounds like noise. I'll give you a little bit of a rein on this, but they're not. Leadership's not excited. It's hard for you to get excited. So when you rewrite it as an OKR and you rally the group around why it's important and why now, and you let the team members, for the most part, propose what the key results look like. That's how they get involved. Then everybody gets excited about OKRs, and then that energy is what you can fuel, the organization to be aligned on the same page.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we're heading almost towards time, so maybe we've covered a huge amount of ground. Maybe I'll just ask you both, Ben and Martin, given you've got such a huge sort of history and experience with this, given when you walk into an organization, what would be the top kind of tips you'd give to leaders who are either using OKRs at the moment or thinking about implementing OKRs based on the myths and the challenges you see?
Maybe I'll go first to give Ben the last word. So the first thing that I always like to do is I like to ask the organization, how much time, how much capacity of the business do you want to give to OKRs, right? Because what is that number as a percentage? Because then we have at least got a constraint to work within. And what I would say is that number that originally is given is always at least 100% wrong. So you usually don't have half the time that you'd like to give. So I'm finding that is the most honest conversation that we need to begin with, is think about what is the capacity we have to focus in this area and use that to drive the conversation, rather than let's get all excited about all the things you want to do, because putting them down on paper and making them sound good doesn't mean they actually might happen. So for me, that's the one that seems to be landing the most in my facilitation.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I'll build off of that, and I'll say I have these sort of 6 quick tips, and the first one happens to be OKRs are not everything. And in fact, what Martin just said is spot on, right? You have to think about what amount of effort will move toward OKRs. And for example, that might vary team by team. So the finance team I was just on, remember my beer company in Malaysia, we actually asked them this question: what percentage of your effort went to OKRs? They said about 20%. Finance team had just a lot of business as usual, getting all this crap done that they got to do. But the COO said, but with AI, we think we can move that to 40% in the next year, because they're literally like starting to not hire finance people, because so much of the routine report building, it's just like, build me a 1040 layout, whatever. It's pretty good. So that was one thing. The second one is less is more. So a smaller set of OKRs is better, especially when you're first starting. I would go with the challenge. You're better off having just one objective for your company with some key results and piloting out that, knowing that might only be 25% of your work effort. I mean, that's fine. And succeeding in that one OKR before you roll it all out and have lots of OKRs all over the place. The second one is crawl, walk, run, which kind of goes hand in hand with that first one. And that is nail it before you scale it. I mean, this is like anything that you do in a business, right? Don't just read Measure What Matters and say, oh my God, let's do it. It's like, no. You want to do it. You're the CEO. You read the book. You do it with your leadership team for the first cycle or two, and you succeed. You crawl there, and then we worry about rolling it out to the large organization. By the way, most good CEOs already know that. So I'm not probably saying anything you don't know, but if you didn't know that and you're a CEO, please write that down, because that'll save you when you go to OKRs. Outcomes, not output, is another big one, because what will happen is, like I said earlier, people will have no problem writing objectives, and then they're going to write all these things we need to do, and they're going to call those the key results. Like, this is the classic pitfall. You've defeated the whole point of doing OKRs, which is to have key results that are actually measurable results, which reflect outcomes that we can all agree on, as opposed to we did a bunch of work and I don't know, we updated the blog, we launched a new website. Okay, great, but so what? It's like, was it even good, or did we just spend a bunch of money updating our website? And then the other one is, the only way to learn OKRs is to do OKRs. So back to my friends who are doing your 8 hours of video training and stuff like on the theory of OKRs. You're not going to learn OKRs by doing that. You're just going to learn some theory thing, and it's not going to be relevant to your business. You would have been better off spending 1 hour, skimming my book or skimming the video training, and then just doing OKRs for the next 7 hours and getting some actual experience with your real OKRs in your business. And then that's how you're going to learn OKRs. You got to just go do it. Okay. And I think that's sort of funny, but that's sort of true with everything. I mean, same thing with tennis, right? You're not going to learn tennis by reading about tennis and watching videos on tennis. You got to go out there and play, and you might suck. Fine print, you might suck. Your serve might not go in, but if you keep practicing, you'll get better. You just got to do it. And then the final thing, and this is a really important one. I came up with this one as a 6th bullet point, which is to embed alignment in everything you do with OKRs. I mentioned earlier that some organizations have these org charts where they, will set OKRs for this department, that department, that department. Actually, they're just enhancing silo effects. Each department is doing their own little OKRs workshop, and none of the other departments could give a rat's ass about the other department, which is do ours, and that doesn't work. So you have to think about bringing people in, even when you're training people on OKRs. Bring people in from other teams. If you're going to put a person's name next to the key result, maybe you put 2 names, one from leadership and one from lower level, or one from business and one from tech, or whatever makes sense for you. How do you embed alignment into your OKRs process all the way through? This is a magic superpower, which is, I'm sort of making fun of Measure What Matters, which talks about the superpowers of OKRs. But the superpower of OKRs comes into play when you, as the OKR team, figure out a way to use OKRs in your organization such that you're embedding alignment in each aspect of your OKRs program. I'll give you one final point. Whatever you do, don't just have HR implement OKRs in your organization. It's going to come across as an HR program. Similarly, don't have the finance team, the CFO, Office of CFO, just drive the OKRs program. It'll come off as a finance thing. And I could go on and on. Simple as this. Pick 2, ideally 3 different people, probably, your chief of staff or somebody from the office of the CEO, maybe somebody from the FP&A team, or, whatever, just popular people in the business. Engineer could be an engineer. Get 3 of them as a quote triad that represents different areas of the business, and have them be the OKRs program owner. So it's not like, oh, this is an initiative from HR. Because even if the CEO says, I want to do OKRs, and here's our VP of HR, and they're going to be on point, everybody in the company just says, oh God, here comes it. It's another HR thing. And it just feels like it's being shoved down their throat by some other department. And you're not embedding alignment into that decision. So I keep coming back to this embed alignment, because I think a lot of organizations that implement OKRs, they just fail to do this. And if you're not careful, you can actually use OKRs to effectively enhance the silo effect. So you really got to be careful when you do OKRs. I mean, it's like any other tool, right? I mean, you have to use it right. And I've given you quick tips.
Fantastic. That's a great, I think, a great place to wrap up. Thank you so much, both Ben and Martin. I know, Martin, very early for you, been the end of the day for you in the US. So I really appreciate your time and your expertise. And look forward to hearing more from you both.
Yeah, great questions. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, everybody.
That was fun. Enjoyed it.